The Subcommittee for Indigenous Peoples of the United States will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on H.R. 4957, Native American Child Protection Act. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Good morning and thank you to our witnesses for being here, willing to travel here. Today we'll be hearing from witnesses on my bill, H.R. 4957, Native American Child Protection Act. There's an enormous need for family violence prevention and treatment resources in tribal communities. This subcommittee has been committed to investigating and addressing the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, including the startling fact that domestic violence impacts 1 in 3 Native American women. Studies show that in 49 to 70% of those cases, men who abuse their partners also abuse their children. However, we have not examined elevated rates of child abuse and neglect among Native American children and how it is worsened by near lack of resources available to tribes to address this issue. That changes today. My bill will improve the prevention, investigation, treatment, and prosecution of child abuse and neglect in Indian country by ensuring tribes have the resources they need to take care of Native children in culturally competent ways. It does so by improving and reauthorizing 3 programs originally passed as part of the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act. The Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act was first passed in 1990 in response to widespread reports that Native children were being physically and sexually abused in BIA-run boarding schools in the 1980s. The purpose of this act was to identify the scope of underreported child abuse in Indian country, fill gaps in tribal welfare services, improve coordination between child welfare and domestic violence programs, and to provide funds for mental health treatment in Indian country. Unfortunately, only $5 million of the $43 million annual authorization was appropriated under the Act, leaving broad sections of the Act unimplemented until its authorization expired in 1997. My bill modernizes and reauthorizes the programs in this Act that are sorely needed in Indian country. First, it reauthorizes and improves the Indian child abuse treatment program by modernizing the definition of child abuse, ensuring tribes can partner with urban Indian organizations for funds if they choose, repealing maximum grant allocations, and encouraging culturally competent care. Second, it creates a National Child Resource and Family Service Center within BIA. The National Center would be empowered to provide technical assistance and support to tribes and urban programs in drafting intergovernmental agreements, training staff, and aiding tribal child welfare programs. Finally, the bill reauthorizes and improves the Indian Child Protection Act and Family Violence Prevention Program by expanding flexibility for the use of prevention funds, encouraging culturally specific prevention programs, amending program standards to be more appropriate for tribal grantees, and increasing program funding to account for inflation and need. Part of the federal government's trust responsibility is protecting the most vulnerable members of Indigenous communities, Native children. Right now, we are failing to protect Native children. There isn't a single federal program providing adequate funding for child abuse and neglect, treatment, and prevention in Indian country. But as I said earlier, that changes today. And this committee is committed to ensuring that the federal government upholds its trust responsibility. That is why I'm proud to have introduced this bill with Ranking Member Cook, and why I'm grateful to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Cook, thank you for your support of this legislation. I would now like to recognize you for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you mentioned, the subcommittee will be receiving testimony today on your bill, H.R. 4957, the Native American Child Protection Act. I am an original co-sponsor and proud supporter of this legislation. This bill, as already mentioned, primarily reauthorizes programs established by the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act, which was enacted in 1990. It created 2 grant programs mandated that child resource service centers be established throughout the 12 Bureau of Indian Affairs regions. The 2 grant programs are intended to provide treatment to the victims of child abuse or neglect and provide a means to help prevent these atrocious acts of abuse or neglect from occurring in the first place. Sadly, funding for the Child Resource and Family Service Centers and the 2 grant programs has been absent since the program was passed. This committee has acted on issues impacting Native children in the last several Congresses, and I stand ready to work with you, Mr. Chairman, on your bill to address important and outstanding issues needing this committee's attention. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Now I'd like to transition to our first panel of witnesses for today. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but you may submit a longer statement for the record if you choose. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green after 4 minutes. The yellow light will then come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please wrap up your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Mr. Spike Bighorn, the Deputy Bureau Director for the Office of Indian Services at the U.S. Department of Interior.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and members of the subcommittee. My name is Spike Bighorn, and I'm the Acting Deputy Bureau Director for the Office of Indian Services at the Bureau of Indian Affairs within the Department of the Interior. Thank you for the opportunity today to provide testimony regarding H.R. 4957, the Native American Child Protection Act. The proposed legislation would amend the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act, a statute that, among other provisions, required the Bureau of Indian Affairs to establish Indian Child Resource and Family Service Centers within each regional office of the BIA in collaboration with the Department of Health and Human Services, and to administer the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Program. It is important to note that Congress has not appropriated funding to the Bureau to carry out the centers or the program since the Act's enactment in 1990. Congress has clearly recognized that there is nothing more vital to the continued existence and integrity of Indian tribes than their children. The proposed legislation will empower tribes to provide programs and services necessary to safeguard their children and strengthen their families. The proposed legislation embodies the well-being of American Indian and Alaska Native children and families by preserving family relationships and increasing the capacity of tribes to provide for their children and families' needs. The proposed legislation expands the definition of child abuse to include psychological or verbal abuse that causes serious emotional or mental injury to a child. Indian Affairs is in support of the updated definition. The proposed legislation amends Section 410 of the Act and removes all references to the Secretary of Health and Human Services and requires the Secretary of the Interior to establish a National Indian Child Resource and Family Services Center within 1 year of enactment of the Act. The proposed legislation requires BIA to submit a report to Congress within 2 years after enactment. It expands the scope of the center to develop training and technical assistance on the prevention, identification, investigation, and treatment of family violence, child abuse, and child neglect for distribution to Indian tribes, tribal organizations, and urban Indian organizations. The proposed legislation also requires the center to develop model intergovernmental agreements between tribes, states, and other materials that provide examples of how federal, state, and tribal governments can develop effective relationships and provide for maximum cooperation in the furtherance of prevention, investigation, treatment, and prosecution of incidents of family violence and child abuse and child neglect involving Indian children and families. The legislation also includes the establishment of a Center Advisory Board consisting of 12 members appointed by the Secretary of the Interior from Indian tribes, tribal organizations, and urban Indian organizations with expertise in child abuse and child neglect. It would authorize Congress to appropriate $3 million per year for fiscal years 2021 through 2026 to carry out the center and associated activities. Interior is in support of the establishment of the National Indian Child Resource and Family Services Center. The center will enhance the activities the Bureau is currently implementing through the Center for Excellence. The Center for Excellence is a training platform with a focus on creating and disseminating information, knowledge, and best practices among tribal and Bureau social services staff in the areas of child protection, child welfare, and family violence. Through the Center for Excellence, the Bureau is partnering with institutions of higher education, including the University of Montana and University of Oklahoma Schools of Social Work, to develop culturally based training and standardized practice and protocols in the areas of child welfare and child protection. The draft legislation amends Section 411 of the Act to provide financial assistance to any Indian tribe, tribal organization, or intertribal consortium for the development of an Indian child protection and family violence prevention program. The legislation requires the Secretary of the Interior to develop caseload standard and staff requirements in consultation with Indian tribes within 1 year of the enactment of the Act. The proposed legislation also requires the BIA to submit to Congress a report on the award of funding under this section within 2 years of the enactment. This report will include 1, a description of treatment and services for which tribes have used funds, and 2, any other information that the Secretary of the Interior requires. The proposed legislation expands the scope for which funds provided under the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Program, Section 411 of the Act, can be used to include three new provisions. Number one, the development of agreements between tribes, states, or private agencies on the coordination of child abuse and neglect programs. Two, child protective services, operational costs, and transportation, including relative searches, criminal background checks for prospective placement, and home studies. And three, the development and implementation of a multidisciplinary child abuse and neglect investigation and prosecution program. Interior recommends expanding the language of Section 411 to include murdered and missing Indigenous women and children and victims of human trafficking, as those two are forms of family violence that are impacting Indian country at high rates. The draft legislation would authorize Congress to appropriate $60 million per year from fiscal years 2021 through 2026 for Interior to initiate the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Program through Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act agreements on reservations. In conclusion, Interior is in support of the proposed changes in the legislation, as the changes reflect the nature of tribal child welfare and family violence prevention programs. Interior looks forward to working with this subcommittee on the Act and provide technical assistance as required. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Bighorn. The chair now recognizes Rear Admiral Brandon Taylor, the Chief of Staff for Indian Health Services at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
Good morning, Chairman Gallego, Ranking Member Cook, and members of the subcommittee. I am Rear Admiral Brandon Taylor, the Chief of Staff of the Indian Health Service, and am an enrolled member of the Seneca Cayuga Nation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the Native American Child Protection Act. The legislation would amend the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act, a statute that, among other provisions, required the Secretary of Health and Human Services, acting through the Indian Health Service and in cooperation with the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the Department of the Interior, to establish the Indian Child Abuse Treatment Grant Program. IHS does not believe Congress has ever appropriated funding to carry out this program. The legislation would replace references to the Secretary of Health and Human Services with references to the Indian Health Service. The legislation would also add psychological or verbal abuse that causes serious emotional or mental injury to a child to the definition of child abuse in Section 403 of the Act. And the legislation would amend Section 409 of the Act to expand the scope of the program. Current law requires that program grants be provided for the establishment of treatment programs on Indian reservations for Indians who have been victims of child sexual abuse. The legislation would expand the scope to treatment programs for Indians who have been victims of child abuse or neglect, and would also allow urban Indian organizations to partner with Indian tribes and intertribal consortia in submitting grant applications. Additionally, the legislation would amend Section 409 of the Act to require IHS to encourage the use of culturally appropriate treatment services and programs in providing grants under the program. Finally, the legislation would amend Section 410 of the Act, which currently requires the Secretary of the Interior to establish an Indian Child Resource and Family Services Center within each area office of the BIA, with staffing for the centers to be provided in an MOA with the Secretary of HHS. The legislation would remove references to the Secretary of HHS, eliminate the requirement of an MOA, and require the Secretary of the Interior to establish only one National Indian Child Resource and Family Services Center. The IHS has an important role in improving the lives of Native youth. Child maltreatment is a term that encompasses all forms of abuse and neglect, and is linked with psychological and emotional problems. It is critical to identify and respond to child maltreatment for the health and well-being of our children, and it requires a comprehensive approach that integrates healthcare within a collaborative community response. IHS's efforts include early intervention, screening, assessment, education, and community-based programming to build resiliency among children and youth and to promote family engagement. One of our programs that focuses on domestic violence prevention is the IHS Domestic Violence Prevention Initiative. The DVPI promotes the development of evidence-based and practice-based models that represent culturally appropriate prevention and treatment approaches to domestic and sexual violence from a community-driven context. While the successful administration of the DVPI has assisted our agency in addressing intimate partner violence in young adults, the program does not specifically focus on treatment and recovery of child abuse and neglect victims. The Native American Child Protection Act would expand access to child advocacy center services that are often not available within tribal communities, such as pediatric forensic examination services, mental health care providers with advanced training in child trauma, and culturally appropriate activities and services geared toward pediatric patients. We appreciate your efforts in helping us provide the best possible healthcare services to the American Indians and Alaska Natives we serve. Thank you, and I am happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chairman will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Bighorn, can you briefly outline the child welfare and protection goals for the BIA?
Yes, sir. Within the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Indian Services, we have the charge of providing the funding through the social services programs and the welfare assistance programs. And we also have developed a program where we provide dollars to specific areas in the country that are experiencing difficulty with child prevention and child abuse incidents. So we try and augment those services with any federal funding that we can provide, and we focus on those areas where we have identified working with local tribes and BIA agencies where there are a number of child abuse and neglect reports that come through, and we do what we can with any dollars that we have provided. Now, also we have a organization, a program that's called the Tiwahi Initiative that is being developed at 6 pilot sites. We also provide some additional child abuse and neglect funding through ICWA and through the Social Services Tribal Budget Priority System to try and address any child abuse and neglect issues that happen in local areas. So through those efforts, we're trying to provide additional dollars as well as technical assistance and training through the Center for Excellence and the social workers that we have in the regional offices.
Great. And how would this bill help your agency achieve these particular goals?
We have the Center for Excellence that I mentioned in my testimony that provides some technical assistance and training to tribes as well as BI social workers. And with this initiative, if it's funded, would be able to augment the services that we provide there and expand what technical assistance efforts that we have ongoing, as well as, in my estimation, provide assistance to tribes who want to expand the background check information and the kiosk project that we have, where we're working with Department of Justice to try and identify the best options and best opportunities to protect our children.
How does your agency engage in cross-agency collaboration as well as collaboration with states and other entities in its work on child mistreatment?
We have a close relationship, sir, with, as I said, the Department of Justice, Health and Human Services when it comes to Indian Child Welfare Act issues. We also have a partnership with, as I mentioned, some of the social work schools to develop mechanisms to provide technical assistance and training to BIA social workers and tribal social workers. And we have developed those relationships through the request of tribal organizations in the field. In some instances, tribal leadership consortiums have asked us to come and provide assistance in developing these relationships to provide these opportunities for training and technical assistance on the ground with tribal social workers.
Thank you, Mr. Bighorn. Admiral Taylor, can you describe what other programs, if any, are run by IHS that provides resources directly to tribes to treat child abuse and neglect cases?
Thank you, Chairman Gallego. Yes, as I mentioned in my testimony, the Indian Health Service sponsors the Domestic Violence Prevention Program, previously known as the Initiative, And those resources have awarded projects to 83 total different tribal programs and tribes over the last several years, with the goals of domestic and sexual violence prevention, advocacy, and coordinated community responses, as well as providing forensic healthcare services. Under the grant, the Indian Health Service has trained nearly 1,700 forensic health examiners across the country, focusing on adult and adolescent sexual examination, pediatric sexual assault examination, and intimate partner violence. We also have several partnerships within HHS as well as outside of HHS with SAMHSA and HRSA, providing assistance to tribes for the training of community members, as well as providing grant funds to Boys and Girls Clubs through the National College of the American Indians that provides mental health first aid training to volunteers and staff of Boys and Girls Clubs across the country. So we're very proud of the partnerships that we have both within the department and outside.
Thank you. And now you'll to Ranking Member Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and Mr. Bighorn, first of all, I want to compliment you on your name. You know, my parents, God love them, but they gave me a name like Paul, which is, yeah, a great saint, but kind of dull. Spike is a great name. I wish I had. I got to tell you. Okay, I'm going to approach this a little bit differently, because this is something that, you know, gets my blood pressure up. You know, and I'm saying, why hasn't this been funded? And before you answer, you're going to get a chance, but I'm saying, you know, we have all these programs. When we have an alert, when a child is abducted, it's right away. And I'm saying, hey, do we have to have a hotline to every member of Congress saying, you know what's happened today? And I think every one of the 435 members would be outraged. But it's, with everything that's going on, it's caught up in everything that's you know, I'm wondering whether we should have different, every time there is an instance of that, with the caveat at the end, this program to help some of these things has not been funded since so-and-so. So any comments on that suggestion in terms of doing something with, you know, we had the opioid crisis, catching the attention of the public, and the elected officials say, yeah, I'll write you the check, here comes the funding right now.
Thank you for your question, also for the compliment of my name. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Great name.
And it's actually my given name, not a nickname. It's my given name that was provided me by my grandfather.
We'll trade places. You can have Paul, I'll take Spike.
Thank you for your question. What we had agree with you that on a daily basis, the staff that we have in the field, and not only at the regional offices at the agency, but also the central office, we try and collect data that would help us in trying to notify the areas where the largest problems and issues occur in this area. And of course, I'm not trying to minimize what's happening across Indian country, but with the limited funding that we do have, we try and utilize that funding is the best way possible. When we work with our local agencies, we work with the tribes and try and determine the areas where the money will go the furthest. And we're talking about, obviously, child abuse and neglect. We're talking about methamphetamine use. And so we try and gather data. We have a child abuse and neglect report that we get every year. The first report is due here at the end of the quarter, developing statistics to try and quantify exactly what the scope of the problem is. We know it's huge, but we do what we can to try and gather that data. And certainly anything that you would require from us as data in this area, we'd be more than happy to provide it and do whatever we're asked to collect the data and provide that back to you so you can assess it.
Yeah, you know, we got more reports and everything like that. I'm just looking as a ways to means to perhaps the sensitivity of this area where when there is something like that, that it is advertised and the funding would go for an alert system right away. And I'm just saying some of these other programs like opioids and this and that, they've been successful in getting attention and funding. And obviously, this is something that's part of the reason I'm on this bill and everything like that. And I think you're going to see tremendous bipartisan support. But here we go again. There's more and more bills where, we get it passed and everything else, and there's no money. So I'm looking for a way to get it done, whether it's outrage, this and that when it happens, hey, Congress has not done anything or blah, 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 blah. Oh, wait a minute, God, no one, it's almost like somebody is telling us to do our job, which is long overdue because of the gravity and how serious this situation is. So I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Cook. I now recognize the Representative Holland of New Mexico.
Thank you, Chairman. Ranking Member, thank you all for coming here today and taking time to be with us. My first question is for Mr. Bighorn. The proposed legislation expands the definition of child abuse. What is the importance of this expansion, and how will BIA implement such changes?
Thank you for your question. The definition of expansion obviously would provide us the opportunity to include those children affected by the expanded definition. I think also, I can't speak for the Office of Justice Services, but that arm I think would have maybe prosecutorial abilities with the expanded definition, and I think also it provides us an opportunity to work with those children who are affected by the new definition that may have not been affected receiving services before.
Thank you. And can I get a verbal assurance from you that your agency will follow through with the requirement that BIA submit a report to Congress 2 years after the enactment of this bill with the status of grant awards and descriptions of treatment and services for grantees?
Yes, you can get our commitment on that. We have many reports that we have to provide in regard to social services, human services, and yes, I can give you our commitment that we would provide that report.
Thank you very much. And my next question will go to Admiral Taylor. Is the department supportive of culturally appropriate solutions for child maltreatment, to your knowledge?
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. Absolutely. The department has been very supportive with the Indian Health Service in ensuring that all care and access to care is culturally appropriate and relevant to the patients we serve.
Thank you for that answer. When reviewing internal policies or programming, how does the department ensure that solutions for child maltreatment and abuse are culturally appropriate? Like, can you just a little more detail about that?
Thank you, ma'am. Within the Indian Health Service, we're in the process of finalizing the child maltreatment policy, and we'll submit it to HHS for final approval and then dissemination. Of course, we have our experts within the department and within the agency who are looking and ensuring that this policy is culturally appropriate, as well as reasonable and what can be accomplished through the policy.
Thank you. And as you highlight in your testimony, the Native American Child Protection Act's Indian Child Abuse Treatment Grant Program has never been fully appropriated. How has this impacted the department's work against child maltreatment?
We're very proud of the work that we've done in allocating resources and working with other partners, both within the department and outside of the department, and even in our communities, to ensure that community members are receiving training to identify and be aware of child maltreatment, as well as policies within our own agency to ensure that those screenings are done. as well as as I referenced in the testimony, through the domestic violence, DVPI, the efforts to expand forensic examinations across the country and train those individuals and professionals across the country has been very helpful as well. And the partnerships go well beyond that with HRSA and SAMHSA and so forth. So we're very pleased with the work that we have been able to do, despite some of the challenges that we experience in Indian country. We'll continue to make every effort to make those partnerships and make the dollar stretch as far as we can.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Holland. Do you recognize? Now recognize Representative Radwagen.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding this important hearing, and I too wish to add my welcome to Mr. Bighorn and Admiral Taylor. At this time, I have no questions, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative. And now recognize Representative Cartwright.
Thank you, Chairman Gallego and Representative Cook. Thank you for your intuitive comments and information on this very serious situation. I mean, it's pretty clear that when the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act was enacted in 1990, it was after reports of widespread physical and sexual abuse in Bureau of Indian Affairs run boarding schools in the 1980s. So we enacted that and never funded it. So I share Mr. Cook's outrage. That's ridiculous. Mr. Bighorn, I want to start with you. Right now, what types of programs or resources actually exist for child maltreatment care and prevention within BIA?
The services we provide in regard to child abuse and neglect and child prevention services, we have the Center for Excellence, which provides training and technical assistance to tribes and Bureau of Indian Affairs individuals in the field. We have a number of funding sources that we have to provide augmented social services funding to tribes through the Tiwahe Initiative. It was an initiative that came forward, as I mentioned a few moments ago, to allow tribes, especially the pilot projects, to use innovative methods to do wraparound services and coordinate with their local areas, Indian Health Service states, and other local agencies that they would use to provide services to their families and children. And also we have developed a relationship with some of the local tribal leadership organizations, getting their input as to what training they need. We've invested in hiring specific individuals to attack this area by providing whatever we can in a form of training and technical assistance. If the tribe says we need training in this area, best practices, share best practices, and we try and find out what those best practices are, and then go out with the tribes and provide them the training. So a lot of what we do is training and technical assistance.
Is it enough, Mr. Bighorn?
Certainly, it's not enough. No,
it's not enough. And in fact, studies have shown that Native American children are victims of child maltreatment at a rate of 13.8 per thousand, compared to the national overall rate of 9.2 children per thousand. Grossly elevated level for Native American children, so thank you for your testimony. I also want to ask you, how many of these programs that you discussed or the resources that you just talked about, how many of them are implemented in the state of Alaska?
We have the Tiwahe Initiative, which is involved. One of the pilot sites is at with AVCP, the Association of Village Council Presidents. They are one of our 6 Tiwahe sites, and they receive additional dollars. We fund 2 individuals at the AVCP to assist with the coordination of these services I described, to reach out and develop partnerships with local agencies, some BIA, some non-BIA, some government, some non-government agencies. And I believe that they focused on providing additional workers with the funding we provided them out in the rural areas of AVCP, the areas that they service, and assist with child welfare issues and child prevention activities.
Thank you, sir. Now, Admiral Taylor, a simple question for you. What is the Department of Health and Human Services position on H.R. 4957? Does the agency support this bill?
Thank you for the question. IHS is supportive of the direction the committee is taking. However, by policy, IHS does not endorse proposed legislation, but we definitely welcome the opportunity to provide technical assistance to this committee as needed.
Fair answer. Thank you. I yield back.
I now recognize Representative Soto.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Bighorn, you mentioned 6 pilot sites working on this issue. Will the agency require promising strategies report for the pilot sites?
Yes, sir, we do. We have a requirement that an annual report be developed by each of the sites, and we work with them providing them technical assistance. They have identified at each site their specific performance measures and goals that they have developed. They've got a plan that they provide us each year, and at the end of each year, they provide us a report on the best practices that they've identified, the successes, and also in some instances the challenges. And we try to provide technical assistance and training to try and mitigate those challenges. But yes, to answer your question, we do receive a yearly report from each site.
Thank you, Director. And Rear Admiral Taylor, you stated that there are 17,000 forensic folks in IHS. How often do the forensics IHS folks work with investigations folks in DOJ?
Thank you. I'm not, honestly, I'm not sure. I would need to take that back and make sure that, that I can answer that appropriately. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, we'd encourage you to provide the committee, go back to your staff and provide the committee with more information on it. We're seeing a lack of coordination in the MMIW crisis. We should make sure we're coordinating to help out our Native children. One moment. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Soto. And I want to thank the panel one for joining us and taking our questions. And we have, where is this? Apologize. Give me 1 second. We have to say something very official. All right, thank you, panel one, for joining us. Now ask panel two to please come up and join the dais.
Could I make one comment?
Sure, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to be leaving the panel. I have another function. It's the Congressional Marine Corps birthday, and I am, for some reason, I have been selected as the oldest Marine in Congress, even though I'm 39 and a half years old, which I regret. So this young lady,
Which is
on the
actually
right-
my age, to be honest.
Well, so I ask to be excused and go to the
It's Semper Fi. As always, the Lance Corporal will take care of the Colonel's job. You're
What can I
excused.
say? Thank you.
As with the first panel, oral statements will be limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will be part of the hearing record. When you begin, the lights on the witness table will turn green. After 4 minutes, the yellow light will come on. Your time will have expired when the red light comes on, and I will ask you to please wrap up your statement. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before we question the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ms. Arini, I apologize if I say that correctly, Martin, a board member for the National Indian Child Welfare Association.
Good morning, Chairman Gallego and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss H.R. 4957, the Native American Child Protection Act. I am Aureen Martin, and I'm a member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa in Wisconsin. I'm here today to provide testimony on behalf of the National Indian Child Welfare Association, or NICWA as we're called, where I sit on the board of directors. NICWA is a nonprofit Indian organization located in Portland, Oregon, with over 40 years of experience in working with tribal nations and state and federal governments to support effective services for American Indian and Alaska Native children and families through training, research, and policy development. Our experience has taught us that the best, most effective solutions to complex issues like child maltreatment come from the tribal communities themselves and incorporate methods that reflect the unique values, culture, and traditions of our best. In opening, I want to express our gratitude for your hard work on this bill and your openness to discussing these issues. NICWA wholeheartedly supports H.R. 4957 and the changes you have made to modernize this law, the law this bill is based on, the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act. As you mentioned in your opening, and several of the witnesses have already discussed, that act was passed in 1991 in response to investigations that revealed pedophiles were preying on Native children in BIA schools and on tribal lands where jurisdictional complexities and programmatic gaps had left children vulnerable. There were two main purposes of the law. First, to establish requirements for improved reporting and collaboration between child protection and law enforcement agencies in cases of child abuse or neglect. And two, the establishment of tribal programs and regionally based resource centers to provide technical assistance to tribes. The reporting and background check provisions have proven very effective and have been refined and expanded over the years. However, funding for the grant programs and resource centers has been almost non-existent, with only a one-time appropriation of approximately $3 million in the mid-1990s. H.R. 4957 would reauthorize and build on the tribal programs created in the original act. NICWA research has found that emphasizing culturally based practices through community-based programs and resources is one of the most effective ways to combat the risk of child maltreatment in Indian country. While we believe we have a successful formula for treating and preventing child maltreatment, Indian country just doesn't have access to funding that we need to carry these programs out. Federal funding for child maltreatment prevention and child protection efforts available to Indian country is extremely limited and comes mainly from BIA and HHS. States, on the other hand, have far more access to federal funding, much of which is not available to tribes, including access to the $1.7 billion Title 20 Social Services Block Grant and the majority of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act funds. The authorizations in H.R. 4957 would help tribes by providing funds to three programs: the Indian Child Abuse Treatment Grant Programs, which are designed to provide treatment services to victims of child abuse and neglect; the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Program, to provide for the investigation of child abuse and neglect and to treat and prevent family violence; and the National Indian Child Resource and Family Service Centers, designed to provide training and technical assistance to tribes on child maltreatment, abuse, and family violence investigations and treatment. These programs are critically important in addressing the inadequate funding available to tribes because they provide real funding directly to tribes and are the only programs designed specifically to fund tribes' culturally based efforts to address these critical problems. Since the passage of the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act nearly 30 years ago, Indian country has seen the development of an array of culturally based resources that are being used to effectively treat trauma and decrease the risk factors for child maltreatment. The act was specifically designed to provide funding and assistance to tribes so that they could use these strategies to treat at-risk families and children and use their knowledge to prevent further hurt and promote healing of the victims. H.R. 4957 delivers on the promise of the original act by recognizing the importance of culturally based treatment and prevention programs and building on its original funding and program authorizations. We support H.R. 4957 and look forward to working with you toward its passage. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Martin. The chair now recognizes Ms. Anita Finday, the Managing Director for the Indian Child Welfare Program and Casey Family Programs.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify to the U.S. House of Representatives Natural Resources Committee's Subcommittee on Indigenous People of the United States. My name is Anita Finday. I currently serve as the Managing Director of the Indian Child Welfare Program at Casey Family Programs, which is headquartered in Seattle, Washington. Casey Family Programs was founded more than 50 years ago as an operating foundation. Casey has invested to support improvements in programs, services, and public policy that benefit children and families in the child welfare system. Casey provides comprehensive child welfare information to support policymakers in safely reducing the need for foster care. Casey also provides analysis and information to support decision-making, bolster system integration, build capacity, and support sustainability. Casey has worked in Indian country for more than 30 years, building partnerships with tribal governments, providing technical assistance, co-managing direct services to children, and providing training on topics such as Title IV-E direct and pass-through funding opportunities, the Family First Prevention Services Act, trauma-informed care, safety and risk assessments, child and infant mortality, and peer-to-peer sharing of best practices between tribal nations. The Indian Child Welfare Program honors tribal sovereignty and recognizes the Indian Child Welfare Act as the gold standard of child welfare practices. I've worked with Casey Family Programs as the Managing Director of the Indian Child Welfare Program for 8 years. Prior to that, I worked for 14 years as the Chief Judge for my tribe. Located in northwest Minnesota, the White Earth Tribal Nation. I have served on the Attorney General's Advisory Committee on American Indian Alaska Native Children Exposed to Violence, which issued a report in November of 2014. The charter of the Attorney General's report mandated that members in the American Indian Alaska Native Advisory Committee conduct 4 hearings and up to 6 listening sessions nationwide. The report concluded in part that despite the tremendous efforts of tribal governments and community members, many of them hindered by insufficient funding, American Indian Alaska Native children suffer exposure to violence at rates higher than any race in the United States. The immediate and long-term effects of this exposure to violence includes increased rates of altered neurological development, poor physical and mental health, poor school performance, substance abuse, and overrepresentation in the juvenile justice system. This chronic exposure to violence often leads to toxic stress reactions and severe trauma, which is compounded by historical trauma. Sadly, American Indian Alaska Native children exposed post-traumatic stress disorder at the same rate as veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan and triple the rate of the general population. With the convergence of exceptionally high crime rates, jurisdictional limitations, vastly under-resourced programs, and poverty, service providers and policymakers should assume that all American Indian Alaska Native children have been exposed to violence. I currently serve on the Alice Bodabeer and Walter Sobolev Commission on Native Children, which is a bipartisan commission created by Senator Murkowski and then Senator Heidi Heitkamp, charged with holding hearings and conducting a comprehensive study of the programs, grants, and resources for Native children, both at government agencies and on the ground in Native communities, with the goal of developing a sustainable system that delivers wraparound services to Native children. I am not providing testimony on behalf of the Commission on Native Children today. In my work as the Chief Judge for my tribe, I presided over many child welfare proceedings and directly observed the trauma, lack of resources, and lack of integrated, culturally appropriate services available for tribal member youth, children, and their families. In my work with Casey Family Programs, we work with many tribes across the country who experience the same limitations. According to SAMHSA, American Indians and Alaska Natives have consistently experienced disparities in access to healthcare services, funding, and resources, quality and quantity of services, treatment outcomes, and the health education and prevention services. Availability, accessibility, and acceptability of behavioral health services are major barriers to recovery for American Indians and Alaska Natives. Common factors that influence engagement and participation in services include availability of transportation, childcare, treatment infrastructure, level of social support, perceived provider effectiveness, and cultural responsiveness of services. There exists a large disproportionality of American Indian Alaska Native children in foster care. According to the latest data available, which is AFCARS in 2017, for example, in Minnesota, American Indian Alaska Native children had a rate of care of 120 per 1,000. The rate for white children was 3.9 per 1,000. The national data shows that nationally in 2017, American Indian Alaska Native children had an in-care rate of 16 per 1,000, while white children were in care at a rate of 5.2 per 1,000. I'm out of time, so I will stop my testimony there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Finde. The chair now recognizes Dr. Art Martinez, a Tribal Child Welfare Specialist at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute.
Thank you, Chairman, and committee members for your time and for your efforts in putting forth this bill and having these hearings in preparation. My name is Dr. Art Martinez. I come to you as a member of the Chumash Tribe of California and as a clinical psychologist. I also come to you today in support of this bill and in support of the bill on behalf of the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, for which I'm involved. We want to state that it's very importantly that I come here on my own time and at my own expenses without any federal funds used to provide this testimony. As a clinical psychologist, I have a unique experience of cultural and professional experiences. I have spent over 30 years involved as a clinical psychologist in treating childhood trauma in Indian country. I also have developed programs for prevention of child abuse and serve also as an evaluator in many programs of child abuse and neglect prevention. As a representative of the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, it's important to note that the Tribal Law and Policy Institute is a 100% Native American-owned nonprofit organization and is designed to deliver education, research, training, and technical assistance programs to promote the enhancement of justice in Indian country, as well as the well-being, the health, and culture of Native peoples. As I come to you today, I hope that my personal experiences and professional experiences might be of some benefit to the committee. I've served as an expert witness in state courts, federal district courts, and tribal courts in over 3,500 cases. I have treated many more in the survivors of child abuse. I have served as the head of service in several tribal mental health programs and was the director of one of the 6 funded child sexual abuse treatment centers under the original act in the mid-1990s. At that time, the conditions that existed in Indian country and that set the stage for the abuse of children within boarding schools and institutions, the lack of coordination and the lack of ability to respond in an appropriate way to child abuse cases continues to exist today at many levels. I come to you representing the children that I have seen, the children that I have treated, the families that don't have a voice here today. I stand with many tribal agencies in voicing my support for this and the need for the amendments to the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Protection Act. It's in that light that I come to you requesting or imploring you to support this bill and to reauthorize this bill with the adequate funding that is necessary to begin the treatment and the attention to this issue that should have been given over the many years. To right a wrong and to complete a promise that had been made so many years ago. I'll just state for you that while chairing a prior reauthorization hearing, the late Senator John McCain, the chairman of the U.S. Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, provided the following explanation concerning the scope and legislative history of the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act of 1990. He said, "Today we address the bill, the Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act reauthorization. This bill provides 4 years reauthorization of appropriations for child sexual abuse prevention and treatment grants, requires data collection to identify the scope of child abuse and family violence in Indian country, and encourages interagency coordination between public and private medical organizations in the treatment and examination of children through the use of telemedicine and other means. The Indian Child Protection and Family Violence Prevention Act was enacted in 1990 in response to the findings of the Senate Subcommittee on Indian Affairs and the Special Committee on Investigations that certain BIA schools had been safe havens to child abusers. Senator McCain went on to say that although the obligation for character investigations is still in effect, it is unclear whether these are being conducted regularly, whether professionals are required to report incidents of child abuse that are required are actually doing so, and whether the mandatory investigations of these reports are occurring. All of this was unclear. What we find today is that these conditions continue to exist, not only in the lack of response from agency-run schools and agency-run efforts, but also in the
Mr. Martinez,
communities
please wrap it up.
themselves.
Please wrap up your statement.
Yes. With that, I would like, in my statement, I have recognized the intergenerational trauma issues that are salient within the families and the treatment experiences that I've had, the federal stewardship that is required in oversight of this and responsibility that is required in order to get funds to the communities and to the families of need, the disproportionality of child maltreatment in Indian country and the ideology of that, and also the disparity of services that exists in Indian country in general to treat families and to bring healing to the family conditions that are there.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez. I greatly appreciate your testimony. I recognize Representative Young for a statement prior to another engagement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for introducing this legislation, and I'm a little disappointed I'm not on the bill, but I understand you just introduced it, so I volunteered to put myself on it right now.
I greatly appreciate that. Thank you.
And this is a good piece of legislation. The one challenge we have, I was here when we wrote this legislation. It may have been McCain's bill, but we had hearings in this committee, I think 3 or 4 times on this legislation. We have a job, it goes for both sides of the aisle, and that's funding. And we didn't pursue the funding as we should have. So I'll give you my support to request this by letter or by phone, whatever happens to the appropriators. So, because it's all needed, it's all stated, the witnesses have said it. What we have to do is make sure we get the money, because it does us little good to authorize it if we don't get them the money to do the job. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I do have to go to the Speaker's office. She's called me over there to spank me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Young, for your time and your dedication. I thank our second panel of witnesses for their testimonies, reminding the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chairman will now recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask of the witnesses. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Martin. Oh, I apologize. Miss Martin. Martinez Martin, I apologize. Ms. Martin, can you briefly explain some factors contributing to why American Indian and Alaska Native communities experience disproportionate rates of child maltreatment?
Yes, thank you. I think that the disproportionate numbers, I don't think you can underestimate the effects of historic and intergenerational trauma on Native populations, particularly Native American and Alaska Native populations. When you think about the most recent history of the last 200 years with tribal populations, we're talking about how they were taken from their original lands and moved to reservations, which creates a loss of their homelands. The movement of Indian children to boarding schools where they lose their identity and they lose their culture. And then the termination and assimilation policies of the 50s, those all combine to create loss, a sense of loss, and that manifests itself in families. And then as they go untreated, it creates a cycle. And all of these add up to increased numbers of child maltreatment cases, neglect, and abuse in Indian country.
Can you also explain how this data related to child maltreatment may go unreported then?
One of the things that we know is that there are different pots of money that tribes cobble together to treat these cases, and that because of the complex jurisdictions between states and tribal authorities and federal authorities, there are different reporting requirements. As we understand it, about 40% of cases, there's really no data available from those cases to use to evaluate and develop additional information. Only about 63% of cases do we have data for, and those are usually cases that are dealt with at the state level. So one of the things about this act, your act, is that that would improve our ability to get data and have better information moving forward.
In your testimony, you highlight many successful and culturally appropriate tribal child welfare services programs. Can you expand on why culturally specific programs are so important?
Well, they're more effective. And so when you have a culturally based program, it really meets the needs of those individuals and how they interact in their community. It recognizes that, and the treatment is just that much more effective because it brings in all of the support systems that they've had traditionally and supports their treatment and their healing moving forward. The value of these can't be understated.
Dr. Martinez, thank you again for coming here on your own expense. Based on your clinical psychologist experience, what are the factors that need to be considered in the development of successful tribal child welfare services programming?
I'm sorry. Well, importantly, the issues of treatment are melded with issues of prevention. Family strengthening is a key to the engagement with family, and that must be built upon an engagement with culture. As we find many times in child welfare services, particularly in the development of prevention services, we find that the engagement with culture is oftentimes overlaid by federal agencies with a requirement for evidence-based programming that has existed in non-Indian situations. So evidence-based in the Native community might be based upon whether a program has been successful within Native communities, but yet that's rarely accepted within federal agencies due to the fact that it hasn't been proven to be successful in non-Indian experiences. So with that, what we have found is that cultural foundation and cultural engagement is a key factor to building family wellness, to defining norms of family, and to regaining the strength that we so desperately need as families.
Thank you, Dr. Martinez. I now recognize Representative Radwan for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome the second panel, and I don't have any questions at this time. But thank you for being here, and I yield back my time.
I now recognize Representative Soto for any questions he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Martin, regarding the current available federal funding for child maltreatment prevention programs, can you explain why American Indian, Alaska Native communities have a difficult time accessing federal funding resources that are otherwise readily available to states and other entities?
Yes, I can. I think one of the reasons, and one of the big reasons, is not what a colleague of mine calls a sin of commission, but a sin of omission. And so when you have these big programs that are being authorized by Congress, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, or even the Title 20 Social Services Block Grant, Congress always has a definition that they use for government, and it doesn't always include tribes or tribal governments. And so when these authorizations go through, we don't have access to those funds. And in the case of these two very huge pots of money, we're left out. So it's usually just kind of an omission in Congress when these bills are moving through the process.
Dr. Martinez, in your professional experience as a clinical psychologist, what impacts do culturally appropriate services have on the overall well-being of tribal members, including families and children?
Thank you for that question. It's important to understand that in tribal communities, we have resounding effects of intergenerational trauma that have existed over generations of experiences throughout our communities, where that is important to understand in the sense that those traumatic experiences continue today. These are not experiences that resound from 100 years ago. These are experiences that each generation of tribal members has experienced, each in their own way and with each wave of traumatic experiences. And so what we find is that the tenets of trauma-informed care seem to also be tenets of treatment and prevention. We build those just as in treating a survivor of domestic violence, in treating a survivor of abuse of many forms in general. One of the key elements to that treatment is, of course, safety, to prevent the aggression from reoccurring. Unfortunately, in tribal communities, we may not always have that. And so we have to sometimes treat the services, treat the family through services while the victimizations continue within the community.
And Director Fine-Day, how important is tribal, state, and federal collaboration, and why is it necessary to establishing successful tribal child welfare services?
Thank you for that question. It's extremely important that tribes, states, and the federal government work together. As I'm sure you're well aware, the largest funding stream for child welfare services is Title IV-E of the Social Security Act. That funds approximately 50% of child welfare services in the United States. In 2008, tribes became eligible to directly access that funding stream. However, in 10 years, only 20 tribes are currently accessing that federal funding stream. Tribes are subject to the same reporting requirements as the states under that act and under that funding stream. Tribes who may have, for example, 100 children in foster care would have to provide the same reporting, comply with the same reporting requirements as, for example, the state of California. So those reporting requirements are really onerous, and many tribes have chosen not to access those federal funds directly. And so this severely restricts the amount of funding that is available for those services for those tribes.
So would you say in your experience that there's a sense of inequality among grant-based funding for tribes as opposed to state and federal?
There is a huge sense of inequality for tribes. They do not have access to comparable funding for that states have for prevention and for services for children who are in foster care.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Soto. I'm going to yield myself further time as necessary for questions. Back to Mr. Martinez. How are Native family structures different than Anglo or Western family structures, and how does this relate to family violence programming?
Thank you for that question. In Native families, what we find is that As members of Native families, we exist within a larger extended family and clan system within our tribes and within our communities. That is a strength of our family. It is a resilience factor. But many times it can also mean that when trauma hits someone within the system of families, it hits everyone. And when we have suffering that occurs within our communities which is responded to basically with despair and a sense of powerlessness to do anything about it, then we have a family system, a larger community, and a clan system who is then resolved or must find a way to kind of survive the situations of abuse given their own skills and given their own resources. The resources of Indian Health Service and BIA just simply aren't there in most situations. The ability of the tribe to effectively prosecute is also a problem in the sense that in many cases, the FBI must decline the case. The declination from the FBI could take over a year while the situation in the community continues to exist. In that way, it is very hard for us to begin treatment in the sense that the investigation has not been completed. And so we have families that are continuing to live in conditions of domestic violence and other forms of violence within the family, whom are relegated to only the most minimal of services.
Thank you, Ms. Martinez. Ms. Finde, according to the KCFM program data, many tribes do not use standardized assessment tools for child safety and risk, often developing their own customized assessments. Can you explain why customized assessments may be necessary for tribes and why increased resources for culturally specific child welfare tools might be beneficial?
Yes, thank you for that question. It's true that tribes often do not access the standard safety and risk assessments that might be used in other contexts. Some of those safety and risk assessments, they are not culturally appropriate, and tribes often tweak those safety and risk assessments to reflect the standards and mores of their own communities. So it's important for all of the tools that are used in child welfare. It's important that all of those tools be culturally appropriate and take into account the specific, as Mr. Martinez mentioned, the extended families that are very common in Indian country, and that all of those safety and risk assessment tools and other tools take into account culture, language, and other differences in tribal communities.
Thank you, Ms. Finde. If there's no further questions from our members, excellent. I thank our panels of expert witnesses for their insightful testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.